everyone, and a very warm welcome to this session in conversation with the Right Honourable Anneliese Dodds, Minister for Development and Minister for Women and Equalities in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. We're delighted to have you all here. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to briefly introduce the session, and then I'll hand over to the Minister to give her speech. And then we'll have some brief conversation between us, and then we'll turn to some Q&A from you. My name is Olivia O'Sullivan. I direct the UK and the World Research Programme here at Chatham House. We're really excited to hear from the Minister about her priorities. Just to do a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in, this discussion is on the record and being recorded, so do keep that in mind. In fact, please do feel free to tweet or to share things that you heard in this discussion. After I've asked the Minister to give her speech, and after we've conversed briefly, I'll come to you in the audience, so do be thinking of questions. If you're here in person, just raise your hand and a microphone will come to you. If you're online, thank you so much for joining us. Do just pop your questions in the Q&A box and I will select a range of them to put to the Minister. When you ask your question, if you're so inclined, we'd love to hear your name and what organisation you come from. Thank you. We're delighted to welcome the Right Honourable Anneliese Dodds to lay out her priorities for meeting international development goals over the coming Parliament. After Labour's victory in the 2024 general election, the new government has set out an ambition to reset relationships with the Global South, aiming for a world free from poverty on a livable planet, delivered via modernised, respectful partnerships with developing countries. But it does this with a much reduced aid budget in a challenging world where progress towards the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, for the majority of them, are off track for their 2030 deadline. And we're in a much more competitive world. Non-allied states vie for influence in developing countries and have significant investment to offer them. What role can the UK play in all of this? Can it meaningfully offer progress, reform, a stake in the current international order to partners in poorer countries? Anneliese Dodds, over to you to tell us about your priorities for that. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Olivia. It's an immense honour and privilege to be here today for the first time as the Minister for Development and for Women and Equalities. Chatham House, of course, has a long history of being at the cutting edge of foreign policy and development thinking. It's the perfect place to share my vision for a modern approach to international development. I'm delighted to see so many of you here, including so many of our partners, from Gates to Gavi to the Global Fund. And I'm proud to say to you all, Britain is back on the world stage, with a minister at the top table advocating for projects and assistance to advance that goal just mentioned of a world free from poverty on a livable planet. I'm very aware that I stand on the shoulders of many pioneering Labour men and women, from Barbara Castle in the 1960s to Claire Short in the 1990s to Hilary Benn and Douglas Alexander in the 2000s. As a volunteer in an Oxfam shop a quarter of a century ago, I could barely have imagined that one day I would be following in the footsteps of those trailblazers as the Minister for Development. Their work was part of a global push that saw the world make real progress. This included meeting the Millennium Development Goal target to cut extreme poverty in half ahead of time in 2015. Today is the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. And between the late 1990s and the early 2010s, the world did make headway in lifting hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Lives saved and lives changed. Many of those gains can never be undone. But as was mentioned, the geopolitical challenges now are stark, and progress against the Sustainable Development Goals is stalling. We do live in a multipolar world with intense competition, and we need to adapt and respond to that world. The world is different, first, because over the last 4 years, the number of people in humanitarian need has doubled. There's been a vicious cycle of an unprecedented profusion of conflicts and the climate crisis, which is now compounding the suffering of some of the most vulnerable people in the world. And many women, girls, and marginalised people are experiencing a devastating rollback of hard-won rights, services, and democratic freedoms. I saw this firsthand during my recent trip to South Sudan. In the horrendous conditions of the camp in Bentiu for internally displaced people, I heard heartbreaking accounts from those who were forced to flee the brutal civil war in Sudan, as well as meeting people suffering from South Sudan's own humanitarian emergency caused by the legacy of civil war and the climate crisis. The conflict in Sudan has now forced more people from their homes than any other conflict, some 10 million people. It's pushed nearly 9 million people into emergency or famine levels of food insecurity. And as I raised at the UN last month, there's a real risk that without global action to prevent it, the worst famine in several generations could happen on the world's watch. Around the globe, millions of people who long to return home are beginning to despair that they ever will, including the Syrian refugees that I met in Jordan, still there over a decade after they fled the conflict, and so many communities enduring such suffering, from the DRC to Yemen, Ukraine, and Myanmar to Gaza and the wider Middle East. In all of this, political efforts have been vital to get aid in, including our reinstatement of £21 million of UK funding to UNRWA as the only agency able to deliver at scale in Gaza, and the further £10 million of wider humanitarian support for Lebanon we announced earlier this month. By the end of this decade, unless more action is taken, some 2/3 of those living in extreme poverty will be living in fragile and conflict-affected states. At the same time, courageous humanitarian aid workers on the front lines of getting help to them around the globe are under attack. We have a moral imperative to turn things around. People everywhere, including the British people, understand instinctively that this is the right thing to do. Compassion, fairness, and refusing to look the other way when someone's in need are all British values, and action is in all our interests as well. The new government's commitment to tackle irregular migration at source is important for those who would otherwise be forced to leave their homes, and important for people in the UK too. That's why, during the recent European Political Community meeting, the Prime Minister announced up to £84 million for projects across Africa and the Middle East to address the factors that end up pushing people eventually into small boats. The world's also changing and becoming different because we see new leadership from the likes of President Lula in Brazil and Prime Minister Mia Mottley in Barbados on everything from reforming the global financial system to tackling hunger and poverty around the world through the emerging G20 Global Alliance, for which I was so proud to announce UK support in Brazil. I've also seen new leadership amongst the women forest rangers who I met in Sulawesi in September. Visiting them gave me an inspiring reminder of the difference we can make to our planet and to people's lives when we work together as genuine partners, where action to preserve forests also promotes sustainable livelihoods, and where economic development goes hand in hand with combating climate disaster. So today's world is very different, but as our Foreign Secretary set out, our progressive, realistic approach draws on the same spirit that Ernest Bevin and Robin Cook animated and energised. For our country to lead once again on development, we will need a new, modern approach based on genuine partnership, trust, and respect. It will mean recognising that for our partners, tackling the climate and nature crises isn't separate from promoting economic growth and meeting humanitarian need, but intrinsic to both. And it will mean making good on our word, not leaving our partners high and dry, and making the most of British talent and expertise to improve people's lives now and in the future. For all of us here in the UK, this challenge is compounded by the damage that's been wrought by previous governments. It is deeply regrettable that the previous government did not value the development agenda, allowing political turbulence to trump the hard work of development and diplomacy, hurting the world's poorest and most vulnerable people in the process. That is the legacy of 14 years of failure and decline, 14 years of division and chaos, 14 years of Britain retreating on the world stage, while the Conservatives were often consumed by internal ideological battles. Despite heroic attempts, including from many of you in this room, both the impact of that turbulence and the message it sent did real damage to our partnerships around the world too. To put that into perspective, some countries with whom we've had long-standing development relationships fared particularly badly, including the likes of Yemen and Ethiopia, where communities were counting on us. In Afghanistan, in the wake of the fall of Kabul to the Taliban, this upheaval removed from about 400,000 people the rations they so desperately needed. And now we see action to promote Afghan girls' education being contested during the Tory leadership contest. We have to turn the page on this if we're genuinely to work in partnership again. We face a host of inherited challenges. The Chancellor set out the difficult fiscal inheritance passed on by the previous government. And this is mirrored in our own work, with important decisions deferred and problems ignored. Consider that asylum costs, which have spiralled in recent years, at present amount to almost 30% of our development spending, while the backlog has soared, with people waiting years to receive a decision, which the Home Secretary is now taking action to rectify. Consider too that so much of our country's current international climate finance commitment was backloaded into these final 2 years. But we are now committed to make good on the promise that the UK will get help to those who need it. The reality is that we will have to take difficult decisions that were balked by the previous government in light of the situation they've left behind. While we do not underestimate the significance or the complexity of those challenges in the shorter term, nor should we underestimate our ability to respond under pressure in the long term. The UK has been ambitious on international development before. I am determined it will be again. Of course, that starts with boosting the effectiveness of our efforts. I want to thank everyone from the sector who fed into the white paper and the civil servants who worked so hard. And I want to reassure you that I value it as a diagnosis of the problems we face and how UK development can help meet them. But I must be clear that we must now prioritise and provide the strategy and the plan that has been lacking, and that is what I am now building. A core element of this is increasing our capability and capacity. The development review, led by Baroness Manoush Shafiq, is about building on the breadth and depth of development experience, expertise and innovation represented here today. In addition, we will work closely with the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, making sure our overseas development assistance reaches those who need it most and where and when it is most effective. Here again, building on Labour's legacy, including the white papers published by Hilary Benn and Douglas Alexander. Yet we must go further still if we're to shift our approach quite determinedly so it's truly modern. First and foremost, that means genuine partnership. Britain is back in business, back on the world stage, and back pursuing that mission of a world free from poverty on a livable planet. And my message is that we will work with others in good faith to build genuine partnership underpinned by our respect for other governments, organisations, communities and individuals. That means building shared plans for the future, not imposing our own, and to quote the Prime Minister, listening a lot more, speaking a bit less. This is exactly the approach the Foreign Secretary is taking, as he recently set out movingly in his speech at Kew Gardens to friends from across the Commonwealth and at the UN in New York. Now, currently, we're seeing those nations which were unable to industrialise bearing the brunt of the climate crisis, with a terrible cycle of floods, droughts, and hurricanes. Because climate and development are interlinked and interdependent, we will put tackling the climate and nature crisis at the heart of everything we do. Domestically, this government has an ambitious climate policy. The drive for cheaper, greener power, being led by Ed Miliband, will not only bring bills down here, help us achieve energy security and meet our goals to decarbonise, it also gives us credibility and expertise abroad as we lead the response to the climate and nature crisis, both bilaterally and through multinational organisations. Indeed, for those of us feeling the benefits of being largely on the other side of the global equation, recognising the fundamental unfairness of the way the odds are stacked isn't just the right thing to do, given all that's passed. It's a vital part of how we renew the trust between us that's fragile to the point of breaking, so fundamental to ensuring that we can work together for our mutual interests. This approach will run through a vast range of work, from developing the new Global Clean Power Alliance and galvanising just energy transition partnerships, to making sure everyone feels the benefits of green innovation. We will work to harness our whole potential by expanding equality and opportunity, including for those held back by racial and gender inequality, a priority for me as the Minister with responsibility for this at home and overseas. And from our bilateral country model to the way we work much more widely, we will demonstrate that we are listening, not just say we are, and do all we can to bring a better offer to the table, so we restore the confidence of the British people in how we use their money and encourage those who take confidence when the UK shows leadership, walking the walk, not just talking the talk. Secondly, we will champion reform for a global multilateral system that includes everyone, works for everyone, and is fit for the future. Labour's proud to be an internationalist party. It was the post-war Labour government which championed the World Bank in its formative days. And Britain under Labour will become a leader again today, determinedly driving forward global reform. That means not just listening to our partners as a priority, but making sure we take action together. When it comes to the humanitarian and development system that's so stretched, we look forward to seeing Tom Fletcher making the most of his new role as UN Relief Chief, and to working with our partners to take a less siloed, more joined-up approach across everything from climate to the needs of women and girls to humanitarian relief. And when it comes to finance, time and again, we've heard from small states and other vulnerable states how difficult it is to access what they need to pursue their ambitions and priorities, to escape the trap of unsustainable debt and to get on a sustainable footing. That's why, in his speech at the UN General Assembly, the Prime Minister set out the case for accelerating reform of the multilateral development banks, including shouldering more risk so they can unlock hundreds of billions of dollars and do more to build a more sustainable economy and help the poorest. Next week, I will go to the World Bank's annual meetings in Washington to press them to shoulder more risk so they can unlock the money that is so desperately needed. We will work with our partners, including fragile and climate vulnerable states, to help them access more, better quality, better targeted multi-annual finance, including for adaptation, through a global financial system that's reformed and ready for the future, and through wider global forums where they have greater representation in the bodies that help shape our shared future, including the IMF and the World Bank. We will champion financial innovation, from the insurance and guarantees our partners are seeking to the climate-resilient debt clauses promoted by the UK that we're calling on all creditors to offer in their current and future lending. Both within government and working with the financial services industry, we will make sure there is more to come, including helping countries tackle the barriers to investment that choke off the flow of private finance. On so many fronts, from trade to taxation, globally, momentum is now building for the sort of change we need to see. And we're committed to making the most of every opportunity to urge it ahead. That's why, at the UN, the Prime Minister called on all donors to make the most of the International Development Association replenishment as a critical milestone in the fight against poverty. It can be bigger, better, and help more people, especially those in fragile states and conflict zones. So on that basis, under this new government, the UK will be ambitious too, increasing our pledge and encouraging others to play their part. And as the Prime Minister highlighted at the UN in recent weeks, there are measures that we can crack on with right now to unlock further resources for sustainability, resilience and renewal, like a new levy on global shipping that takes account of the true cost of emissions and puts the proceeds, cutting them even further and helping communities cope with their impacts. Third, we will make sure the UK's expertise and ideas are at the heart of reliable development partnerships. When we work together across development and diplomacy, we maximise our impact in everything from helping countries harness the opportunities of renewable energy, to reversing the vicious cycle of conflict, to empowering women and girls. This government will be proactive about all the UK has to offer the world. Our country is brimming with talent and brilliance. We're home to research and innovation on everything from nutritious and resilient crops to new medicines and vaccines, cleaner mining and emerging technologies. We have world-class universities, finance institutions and expertise in leveraging private capital into low-income emerging countries, including through BII. Both within government and in the City of London, we will make sure there is more to come, including helping countries tackle the barriers that choke off the flow of private finance. We also, of course, harbour top-tier businesses ready to share their insights and innovation with peers around the world. And we harbour dedicated volunteers in everything from health to education to search and rescue to the protection of nature and so much more. We're determined to put this talent and commitment to work, making sure we can connect British expertise and British solutions with international partners in the spirit of collaboration and partnership. And as the Member of Parliament representing a large part of Oxford, a city full of people who've dedicated their entire working lives to serving others in need, this is a personal priority for me. Fourthly, and finally, in doing all of this, the new government will be confident in publicly championing the power of international development, so we all feel the benefits of working together to make headway. At a time when the Prime Minister and Chancellor have set us all a challenge to grow our economy and bring opportunity to people across our country, we know our partners around the world share these goals for their countries and their people as well. From clean energy to protecting and restoring nature, land and sea, and from trade to tackling illicit finance. So that means no more apologising for making progress where we can, and more recognition that putting our best foot forward in all we do at home and around the world is in everyone's best interest. Finally, I want to emphasise how much I look forward to working with all of you in the months and years ahead. In the last 14 weeks, I've seen what development can achieve, from promoting green growth in Indonesia to helping keep Syrian girls in school in Jordan to promoting a literal lifeline in South Sudan. I've seen how the UK can promote modern partnerships at big global meetings from Rio to New York to Hamburg. And time again, I've been reminded that, as Mandela said, our human compassion binds us to one another, not in pity or paternalism, but in pursuit of our common purpose of relieving suffering and reinvigorating hope for our shared future by working towards it together. Now, Mandela also said that together, as you all know, we could make poverty history. Well, much has changed since the time when he said that 20 years ago, under a Labour government, for good and for bad. But it remains the case that the only way we can tackle shared challenges, from getting help to those in need to preventing global health crises, is by working towards it together. That's the only way we can make the most of shared opportunities, from reforming the global financial system to healing the natural world. And that's the only way we can make good on the promises we've made at home as well. From the first duty of government to keep our nation safe, to our mission to grow our economy so we bring opportunity to all. Sadly, there are forces hell-bent on setting the global north in opposition to the global south. But partnership is part and parcel of how we overcome them and make sure that those of us who care about our shared future are able to work towards it together. Ministers and civil servants, everyone here today, medics, firefighters, teachers volunteering their services, brave journalists, and people up and down our country, including our proud diasporas, doing so much for our communities here and their families and friends overseas. The British people understand this deeply, and it's extraordinary that even in challenging times, people find a way to help. I have no doubt that the compassion of the British people will shine through once again now. So today I am delighted to announce that the government will match public donations to the new Disaster Emergency Committee appeal to help charities do more to get life-saving help to civilians caught up in the conflict in the Middle East, across Gaza, Lebanon and the West Bank. People who find themselves in desperate need of humanitarian relief. That support builds on the humanitarian aid this government has announced for Gaza, Lebanon and Syria since July. We will match public donations to the new appeal up to £10 million, and together we will make a difference. Thank you so much, and I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Minister, thank you so much. And you'll have to forgive me, I have the cough that it sounds like most people in this room have. My sympathies to us all. But thank you for taking the time to set out your priorities and tell us about how you're thinking. That's a long list of priorities and an ambitious set of priorities. And any ambitious programme requires resources. So you mentioned that up to 30% of the current overseas aid budget is being spent at home or has been spent at home on refugee and asylum seeker accommodation. We saw over the past couple of fiscal years, the previous government did top up the aid budget to some degree to mitigate the risk of that being spent at home. We're a few weeks out from the budget now. Some groups have warned that if the budget isn't topped up again, the actual amount going overseas will be the lowest in many years, potentially since 2007. So I hear the emphasis in your speech on the things the UK can do that are not just about money, that are about reform, that are about the international system. But nonetheless, tell us about those conversations about the aid budget. Where is it going? If it isn't topped up this year, how do you square your list of priorities with the limited resources at your disposal, and will that change in future?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that question, and it's my strong belief, and thank you for referring to priorities, that we do have to prioritise. That's why I've said there are those 4 key shifts that we need to make, and we need to be very explicit about being strategic in how we operate on international development. I think that's very important because we desperately need to have a longer term approach, and I feel that's not what we've had actually over recent years. You did refer to the previous situation, and it's been a very turbulent one actually. We've seen a lot of change over the years. We've seen those costs, as you referred to, the so-called in-donor refugee costs, going up, fluctuating in a way that hasn't been controlled. And of course, previously, there wasn't a plan to deal with those costs. The new Home Secretary, Yvette Cooper, has set out a plan to deal with those costs. It set it out in Parliament in July, and that plan is now being implemented. And it's really important that it is, because of course, what we see currently is a situation where, in order to ensure those costs go down, we have to have an approach right across government, and it will include activity from international development, because we all know that people generally do not want to have to leave their homes. They don't want to have to be put in that vulnerable position. And the UK can do more to be supporting those who've been forced to become refugees. And we've announced that through a number of interventions since we came into office. And I really think it is important we're playing our part with other countries in that global effort, especially when we see such a level of displacement globally. Now, I'm really determined that we get to a longer term situation. Of course, I'm determined that we do get to 0.7%, of course. That's a manifesto commitment for the Labour Party that's very important for us. Every department at the moment is in a difficult financial situation, but I've been very clear that actually for the UK, and particularly for my political party, international development could not be more important. I set out the legacy in my speech. This is an area where we can act to make sure that we're supporting people globally and have such a positive impact for people at home as well. So we definitely want to see an end to that turbulence and a longer term strategy when it comes to international development funding.
Thank you. And as Yvette Cooper implements that plan, your expectation is that that will free up more resources for you to spend overseas?
Well, Yvette has set out the measures that need to be taken to stop the situation that is clearly very bad for those who, for example, are in asylum accommodation, some of them for many months, to reduce the cost for the taxpayer, which is incredibly high. And ultimately, that will then have that impact on those figures within the overseas development assistance budget. And, you know, the UK is an outlier here. Of course, ODA being jargon, overseas development assistance being used as the category for in-donor refugee costs is an international statistical convention from the OECD, but the level of that funding within the UK proportionally is significantly higher than in other countries, and we're really bearing down hard on it.
Thank you. I wanted to put another issue to you. We're just past the 100-day mark for this government, and there has been some commentary that it's been a tricky start in terms of communicating the government's priorities clearly. And you talked in your speech about getting the British public on board with development and with aid. So can you tell us a bit about how you think about that? It's arguably not always popular to focus on problems overseas when people are feeling the pinch at home. So what's your strategy for communicating clearly what your priorities are and bringing people with you?
I think it's really important that we have a government that is confident about this. And I'm very confident in talking about what we have been doing since coming into office to promote that mission of a world free from poverty on a livable planet. I think when we're very explicit about exactly what taxpayer money is delivering, there's very strong support for it. I think there are challenges when there isn't clarity about what that money is delivering, when there are concerns about value for money. That's why, for example, the Independent Commission for Aid Impact is important. That's why making sure that we have a strategic approach that's joined up is important. It's also why working with partners is really important, so that we're doing as much as we possibly can with others as well. But I think we can see that actually in the UK, up and down the country, there's very strong support for international development. You see that in the extent of volunteership that I was referring to in my speech, but I'm confident we're going to see it actually with this DEC appeal as well. I'm confident that we will see the British people supporting that in the same way that they've indeed supported many DEC appeals that have taken place, including after the pandemic. So I think it's important we don't lose sight of that. I do genuinely believe that's an important part of the values that make our country very special.
Thank you. I want to ask you a final question, and I know the audience will be absolutely burning with questions, and we've got a lot online already. You brought up the DEC appeal that you mentioned there, and I know alongside that public appeal and the commitments that you've made today, the government has committed significant amounts in aid to the situation in Gaza to meet humanitarian needs. But there are serious concerns from a number of reputable sources, including UN bodies, including the UK's own Independent Commission for Aid Impact, that aid, including UK aid, is not reaching populations in dire need. Can you tell us a bit about what steps the UK is taking to apply the political and diplomatic pressure needed to ensure Israel fulfills its responsibilities to enable the free flow of aid, humanitarian access, protection of humanitarian workers? How is that working? What will you do if you don't see progress on this issue?
Well, this has been a priority for the new UK government since really the first days of coming into office, and the need for action here clearly is only intensified. I'm extremely concerned about the situation in northern Gaza, as I'm sure many people in this room will be. And I said in Parliament a couple of days ago, and I'll say again today, restrictions on aid are unacceptable. And the UK government has been crystal clear on that, and we've been using every avenue to make sure that message is heard loud and clear. That's included with a whole range of partners, including UN agencies. Of course, the new UK government acted speedily to switch on that support for UNRWA again, and as you would expect, that's a matter that I've discussed in detail with the leadership of UNRWA, also with other UN agencies as well, seeking to work with them and with our partners too, making sure that message is loud and clear. That is included with the Israeli government as well, and the Foreign Secretary has repeatedly made that case. It's incredibly important that people in need have access to the aid that they require. That covers, of course, food, and we see now very large numbers of people who are in food insecurity now. Also water and sanitation, where there have been very significant problems. And this appeal is important to be supporting the aids that people need. But as you mentioned, we have been seeking a range of other avenues to be really promoting that case. And I went to Jordan a few weeks in as quickly really as I could get to the region so that I could see for myself the activity to be getting aid into Gaza. Now, actually, that situation has got harder compared to what I was seeing then, and we'll keep pushing that case for greater access. It's so desperately needed.
Thank you. Let me open it up now to questions in the room. Okay. Let me go down here first.
Hi, I'm Lara Spirit.
You've got a mic.
Hi, Lara Spirit from The Times. I know you just mentioned ODA, but if it's okay just to ask a bit more specifically on that the policy is to carry on counting in-donor refugee costs as part of the foreign aid budget. During the election campaign, Keir Starmer said that he didn't want to do that anymore. And so if that is going to continue happening, are you hoping for an emergency uplift in cash so that there isn't a big cut to humanitarian aid, or perhaps, as some have suggested, a cap to the Home Office's budget and the amount that it can count as foreign aid? Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great. It's probably easiest if we do them one by one. Thank you so much for that question. Actually, including that figure within ODA is part of an international accounting convention from the OECD. But what's very different from this government is that we're not willing to continue to accept that situation where you have such turbulence in the aid budget that's been caused through that, essentially that spending being completely uncontrolled. It's not acceptable. We are determined to be bringing it down, and we've been really clear about that. There wasn't a plan there previously. There is a plan now, and that's part of that broader commitment to the value of international development that's really important to the new government.
Yeah. Thank you. Let's see. I'm just trying to remember the order that people put their hands up in. Let's go with the gentleman standing there. I'll take a couple. So, Sarah, if you ask your question, I'll take a couple more. So we'll do a few.
Hi, Mike Podmore from Stop AIDS. Despite COVID fatigue and many competing global crises that you've mentioned, conflicts and other development priorities, I think we all know it can't be an option to deprioritise global health or tread water in the fight against the world's existing or future killer diseases. We know that if we're not making progress against them, we're losing the fight. And this costs ourselves even more now and in the future in terms of lives lost and money spent. So noting this and your welcome recommitment to renew leadership through multilateralism and investing in effective multilaterals that are really grounded in true global partnerships with stakeholders in low and middle income countries, can you reassure us that there will be sufficient ODA and a continued prioritisation of global health by FCDO, particularly to ensure that we have strong commitments to the key multilaterals like the Global Fund, Gavi, WHO, UNITAID and UNAIDS that will allow them to build on the progress that we've made, but also sort of get us close to or even achieve the SDG health targets. Thanks.
Thank you. So we'll bank that one on global health, and I'll go to the gentleman there. Sorry, there isn't very helpful, is it? That's it, you've got it. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Cy Bishop, Chief Executive of BBC Media Action, the BBC's international charity. Right now, there are Ukrainian journalists on the front line wearing flak jackets and helmets, paid for by FCDO and delivered by BBC Media Action, and they report back to a TV, radio, digital studio, also built by us with support from FCDO. Do you accept this as an exceptional example of the priorities you've just laid out, working in conflict zones, supporting the Ukrainian public, leveraging British talent, great British talent, and indirectly delivering more soft power to Britain?
Thank you. I'm going to take a question from online. So Jerome Phelps from Debt Justice has said, it was encouraging to hear you speak about the need to tackle unsustainable debt. And he's asked what scope you see to strengthen the G20 common framework to enable more extensive debt restructuring. I hope Jerome will forgive me, I'm going to add to that question. In general, what role do you see for the UK to enable debt relief and restructuring, especially given now so much of developing country debt is held by the private sector, held by China, in contrast to where we were maybe 20 years ago when this issue was also on the agenda. So 3 questions for you there. Prioritisation of global health, how we think about the role of supporting media, including in enabling British soft power, and the question on debt restructuring, what the UK can do, what the G20 common framework can do.
Absolutely, and they're all incredibly important questions. Thank you so much. First of all, around global health, absolutely, and I think it's really important here that we're very clear as politicians in communicating the incredible progress that has taken place. I mean, just looking at HIV and AIDS and how over a relatively short period of time, 30 to 40 years, we've seen incredible improvements in treatment. Just last night I was talking about some of the very new innovations, bringing down the cost and making far easier and simpler the treatments for people who already have HIV/AIDS. So much that has already been done as well to prevent transmission from mother to child. It really is something we should be very proud of, because the UK has played a huge part in that, and you're right to draw attention to it. I'm aware that we have a number of replenishments which are coming up across the board. Obviously, the Global Fund, we've got Gavi, we've got a number of others as well. And of course, the UK will seek to play our part in those to make sure there is the global leadership on health that the UK has rightly played a part in previously, and that we need to play in the future. Thank you very much for the point made about journalism. And again, I think this is something that is very important for our country, the fact that we do have those linkages internationally. I would say both in relation to journalism, but also fact-finding as well, where the UK has played a very important role. We're seeing that now in relation to Sudan. I was really pleased that the mandate was renewed after a lot of diplomatic work from us in that context. It is really important. I think it's a fascinating example that was mentioned, a really important one. And as was mentioned, this is crucial for what's sometimes called soft power. I know people have different views about whether that's the right way of phrasing it. But of course, the Foreign Secretary is currently conducting a review on soft power. And I know all of these kind of questions will be discussed within it. And then on debt, just as you said, Olivia, I think we are globally in a different situation in some ways to where we were back at the time of, for example, Jubilee 2000, where clearly, as you said, we have a number of different sovereigns to whom that debt is owed, particularly China now holding much more of it, but also we have the private sector much more engaged in holding that debt now. However, the need for change is also very urgent, just as it was back then, because we see such a large number of countries now who are having to pay more in debt repayments, as many people will know in this room, of course, than they're able to pay out in terms of essential healthcare and education services. So we do want to ensure the UK is playing a leadership role here, particularly in the G20, where there's been quite a lot of work on pushing innovation, thinking about what more could be done. I would mention the Paris Club as well. We need to be making sure that we're pushing hard there. And really, I want to be looking at every way that the UK can be working on this question, because it is holding back the development of so many societies and communities in a way, as I said, that is quite similar to what we saw before even if the nature of that debt has changed over the past few decades.
Thank you, Minister. All right, let's take another selection. We'll go to this side of the room. So the woman in the middle of the row there, can you see? Yeah, okay.
Hello, I'm Sarah Bradford from SOS Children's Villages. I'm particularly interested in what the UK government is planning on doing around children, and in particular those in the most vulnerable situations, so those without parental care or at risk of losing it. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a few more. Let's go, Mahim, if we go to the woman a couple of rows back from there in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Ludovica Nedda from Care International UK. As you know, aid cuts had a devastating impact on the lives of women and girls in particular, and overall we know it was not a strategic nor effective way of doing development. How will the government actually ensure that gender equality programming is protected, particularly in the context of the upcoming difficult budget decisions? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm going to add an online one to that. So Ruth Bergen has asked, she said, it's long been known that shifts in terms of trade in favour of developing countries have the potential to have more impact than aid alone in many cases. The Minister oversees a joint unit with DBT, the Department for Business and Trade. Could you say something about your vision for ensuring UK trade, excuse me, UK trade is aligned with our SDG commitments, and how trade can be shaped by the poorest, the most marginalised, including workers in global supply chains? So something about how we think about trade in this agenda, alongside the questions about women and girls and children in need, particularly those without parents.
Absolutely. Well, again, thanks so much for those really important questions. And first of all, in relation to the situation of children, I mean, I think, unfortunately, we always see, particularly in situations of conflict and humanitarian need, that it is so often children, especially, as was mentioned, those who are without their parents, also the mothers and children, disabled people and the elderly who tend to suffer the most and suffer most quickly. And it really is important to understand circumstances and the whole range of circumstances when we play our part as the UK in trying to work with others to deal with humanitarian need. I felt this very keenly, actually, when I was in South Sudan. As I mentioned, I met some of those who'd fled Sudan. Actually, quite a number of them were South Sudanese people who'd gone to Sudan thinking it would be safer, but obviously it isn't now. They've had to come back. Many of them were unaccompanied children. You know, their fathers had been removed, forced into fighting, and they were in an incredibly precarious place, having to pretty much fend for themselves. And making sure the system is alive to their needs, I think, is incredibly important. I would also say understanding that it's often girls as well as boys who really are very vulnerable in these situations. You know, even things like just going to the toilet can become times of vulnerability and threat for girls in some situations. You know, from that right through to the need to support girls' education, which is something that I'm really passionate about. So thank you for raising that important point. Secondly, around women and girls, I think it's really important that the UK shows leadership at this time. We're seeing a global rollback on particularly sexual health and reproductive rights. And I think, again, this is an area where we as the UK have to be very confident in our arguments. You know, we know the model argument, of course we all do, but the economic argument couldn't be clearer as well. You know, when you have very high levels of maternal mortality, for example, over 1 in 100 in South Sudan, you cannot have a growing economy. You know, clearly we would all think about the moral impact first, but that economic argument is one that not only do we need to be making sure we're incorporating into our own development work, but we need to make sure that multilateral institutions are well aware of this as well and incorporating it in what they do. And I've certainly been arguing very strongly for that since I came into post just over 3 months ago. And then Ruth Online's point about trade, I think is a really important one. And I'm absolutely delighted that the Minister who's focused on these issues for the new government is Douglas Alexander, of course, someone who's had so much expertise in international development itself, who's very switched on to these issues, to making sure that trade can indeed be that mechanism for economic development, also for ensuring as well that there is the adaptation and mitigation that we need in climate terms as well in countries that require that support. And I know that he is very interested in the work that, for example, Ngozi's been doing in the WTO around trade for development, and we are working very closely together on that agenda. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're doing well. Got time for another round. So the gentleman in the middle of the row there in the blue shirt.
Minister, thank you. That's wonderful. Ed Davey, head of WRI in the UK, in Ranil's and Mark's very, very good book on the history of DFID. From the Clare Short years onward, you had Blair and Brown, who so loved this agenda that at every point they backed their minister. I intuitively feel that your Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, and our Chancellor are in the same ilk. And yet, with the exception of the PM's fantastic speech in New York, I haven't yet heard them speak with the same propriety and sincerity that I hear from you here on this agenda. And I feel that we'll need that over the coming years if you're to realise your brilliant vision, Minister. Thank you. Love to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Ed. Right, let's go. I want to make sure people at the back get a look in. The woman at the just behind you, Mahima. That's it.
Thanks. Hi, I'm Jenny Wilson. I'm the chair of the Global Board of Restless Development. You mentioned a lot about genuine partnerships, wanting to listen more and having a more modern approach to development. So I'd love to hear a bit about how you're going to intentionally listen to civil society, particularly youth civil society in the countries that we work, and yet being really intentional rather than tokenistic with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. And there have been a number of questions online that I hope people will forgive me. I'm going to combine. So quite a few people have talked about the merger of DFID and the FCO. Some have touched on how you will address a perception of flight of skilled people. Lots of people left when the merger happened. Others have talked about, one of the rationales for that merger was to bring political and diplomatic levers together with development and humanitarian levers. And in your speech, you talked a lot about conflict and the political roots of conflict and the drivers of poverty and marginalisation. I think what a lot of the questions are getting at is they would like to hear your take on how you combine political and diplomatic pressure with humanitarian and development aid effectively when looking at those situations around the world. So we've got how committed are the PM and the Chancellor to this agenda? Tell us your perception of that. How will you, in practice, really be listening to civil society, especially young leaders? And those questions around the merger, particularly how it will work going forward and how you bring those levers together.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for those really important questions. And thanks ever so much for the very kind words. And I mean, I think I can't really be clearer than underlining that international development, I think, is absolutely fundamental right across all of the new cabinets. I mean, all of us are people who are committed to that, and that, of course, includes Keir and Rachel. And I would say particularly for the Prime Minister, his work and track record around promoting human rights, not just domestically, but internationally as well, is something that shows he understands the need for that joined-up approach internationally. And Rachel, as well, is someone, relating this to the previous discussion, who's absolutely passionate about women's inclusion in the economy. And that has been international as well as domestic. And, she's spoken a lot about this. And I'm really delighted that she's going to be at the IMF at a similar time as I'll be at the World Bank next week, really pushing that UK leadership around these questions. I think we feel a very heavy responsibility. We know that in many ways the world is at a crossroads. We have to show that UK leadership. And I know that Keir and Rachel are really determined to be doing that, as well as I said, all of the UK cabinet. The point about civil society I thought was a really important one. And it is about making sure that there's not just listening and, as you said, not kind of tokenism or a tick box approach, but really hearing what those groups are saying about what's actually needed, what is really genuinely going to make the difference. And one thing that I've been doing whenever I've gone on visits as a new minister is to make sure that I'm meeting with the women's groups, with disabled people's groups with young people, making sure that I'm hearing direct from them about what their concerns are, and then thinking, well, are we actually delivering on what those concerns are? Are we making sure that we're working in partnership in that way? Now, I recognise this isn't completely uncomplicated. You've got those power relationships, of course, that will apply in different contexts. But, with that overall vision of a world free from poverty on a livable planet, we need to be focused on what's going to deliver that. And that means having, both an understanding of people's views, but also making sure there's accountability as well. I think that's really important. And then the point that was raised about the department and the institutional architecture, I think is a really interesting one. Actually, I genuinely believe, and it was kind of you to refer back to this, Olivia, a few moments ago, I genuinely believe so much of what we see now, where there's especially intense humanitarian need, is due to political factors of one type or another. You rightly mentioned conflict. I would say also access to resources, the availability of land, the possibility for different groups of people to have access to the labour market, discrimination. All of these issues are political issues. And, for me, looking at some of the biggest humanitarian crises, particularly Sudan, for example, it's not possible to divorce the political side of that from humanitarian needs, because, we see now, appallingly, starvation being used as a weapon of war. We see a lack of aid access and unacceptable restrictions on aid. We see both sides believing that they can win that war and never mind the consequences for the millions of people who are suffering. So we have to be able to bring together diplomacy and development. Now, we need to be doing that effectively. I do believe we've got to boost the capacity and capability of development within the FCDO. Obviously, Manoush is working hard on that. Her review is progressing, but we're not waiting until she's finished. We're getting on with ensuring that we're doing what we can to boost that expertise. But I would just say, finally, I'm not saying this to butter up all the civil servants in the audience, but I have been delighted to see the depth of expertise that we have in our country. I really have, whether it's in the civil service or beyond it. Now we've got to catalyse it and really use it to make sure that we're driving that change for the world's poorest people.
Thank you. Okay, we've got 3 minutes. I'm going to put an online question to you. We've had a couple of questions, but Dylan Casson in particular has asked about how the government envisages collaborating with the EU on aid, particularly in Africa in a post-Brexit environment. Is there scope to multiply or amplify our efforts? The government has announced a reset of relations with the EU, mainly focused on security. Is there scope for aid and development collaboration within that, and how do you see that? Take one or two more in the room. Let's go to the gentleman here.
Thank you, Rob Merrick from the news website DebEx. Can I press you again, Minister, on debt relief? Because the UK is thought to have unique leverage in this area because 90% of the debt agreements involving private creditors in low-income countries are written in English jurisdiction. So it's argued we could change the law to force private creditors to take part in those agreements, which they're currently refusing to do. 3 years ago, when you were Shadow Chancellor, you called for this. You said change the law. That's what you urged the then Conservative government to do. So can I ask, please, is it still your view that the UK should change the law in that way? And do you believe you have Rachel Reeves' support to do that?
Let's take those two.
Yeah, sure. First of all, on Rob's question, I do agree that I think the UK has a potentially unique role to play here, absolutely, both for the legal factors that were mentioned, but also because of the fact the City of London is, of course, in our own country. Now, the nature of the debt has changed, as we were talking about, but the impact is just as intense, if not even more so. So I think we do need to be looking at what we can do. I talked about the G20, also the Paris Club. I am aware that, of course, it was through a private member's bill, I think initially, that the previous approach to this was advanced. I do think we need to be doing more, and I'm looking across the piece at this. But for me, the most important thing initially, and of course I've been in the job for 3 months, is to be using the mechanisms that we already have. That means G20 with the changes that have been made, and the Paris Club as well. And we've not just been advocating this, by the way, bilaterally. We've been working with many of our partners on this agenda very concretely. And just to relate that to Dylan's question, clearly we've got a bit of change at the moment in the EU, new commissioner coming in. I've been very grateful to have been able to have some conversations with Jutta Urpilainen. I'm sorry, Jutta, if you are sent a clip of this and I've said your name wrong, I do apologise. But she's been very open about what opportunities there would be for us to make sure that we are ultimately, again, working in partnership where we can. We don't clearly have the same relationship that we had before Brexit. Brexit has happened, but we're determined to make sure that we are revitalising our partnership. I would say also, though, bilaterally with other European nations, and of course with the Global South too. And I think there's so much potential. When I was in Brazil, having a lot of discussions with them about work that they've been engaged in. Also South Africa, of course, the current and then the future G20 leadership. I think there are a number of areas where we can demonstrate that partnership very effectively as the UK, make sure that we're delivering more effectively as a result of that, above all, for people and for planet as well.
Minister, thank you. We're on the dot at 2, so I'm going to have to close it there. I'm so sorry, there were so many questions. Thank you to you all for your interest in this event, which was vast, and for all of the informed questions. We asked you about a real array of issues there, Minister. So thank you to everyone, and thank you to you, Minister, for coming in to tell us about your priorities. We hope to have you back again soon to let us know more about how it's going. Thank you.